Fancy intro music, yeah! Woo!
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel where today we're taking a look at the Anti-Trinity officers. And as the name would imply, with our man Gowron here leading our Kumari, there is a Trinity officer set. And when we are describing those, that doesn't really translate to something in the game. So we need to tell you what they are. I made a video quite a bit ago called the Trinity officers about the three officers that boost piercing values and are probably arguably the most important PvP officers in the game, as well as very, very useful for even hostile grinding and fighting those gold hostile bosses, which don't operate as normal hostiles. A very important set in the game that Marcus, Char, and Kang, as you can see in the thumbnail to the right, will boost various values to make your life a little bit easier. But now there is a counter system to the game where there were some officers who worked in a way similar, like Linkasa, but now we've got three new officers in the game with three very important and impressive officer abilities that could help counteract some of that. And we want to take a look at those officers today and get an idea of how they work. And those three officers are Gowron, Martok, and Bael. So without further ado, let's just jump straight into it. And we'll start with this right here, going over our man Gowron. So I've got him as a leader on the Kumari. We'll talk about why here in just a second. But Gowron is going to give you a bonus to energy weapons by 50%. We're not necessarily too worried about the captain's abilities here, more so the officer's abilities, but still worth noting as you are going to see some logs with them as captain. Second ability, here's what we're really wanting to focus on: increasing the shield deflection based on crew health. So taking the stats of the crew and using those to boost those mitigation numbers. You can see it goes 200, 500, 800, 1100, and then 1400. Now, why are those percentages on the right side important? Because it honestly means that these rare officers are more important early in the game, or more effective early in the game, than the epic counterparts. So Marcus, Charvanek, Kang, the Trinity officers that we always talk about wanting to upgrade, and the first things that you want to get to your transporter pattern store after Pike, well, they go 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. So at tier 5, they have a higher value than Gowron, Martok, Bael. But every other tier, these are superior, helping counteract what they can do in the game. And we'll see examples of that in a little bit. Now to continue on, here's another one. Now we're going to switch over to Martok, who is basically like Gowron, but simply doing slightly different things. He focuses on kinetic weapons as his captain's ability. And then over here, you're going to see using crew defense to boost ship dodge. So that's the primary stat for a interceptor. And then finally, last but certainly not least, the beautiful, I actually really like this episode in, Worf has got some great storyline episodes in Star Trek, but Bael, where she's going to be boosting the armor of a ship using crew attack and then just giving a flat weapons bonus. As a captain, she's definitely the weakest of the two here. But anyway, this is how all three of them work in terms of their abilities and their stats. And you can say thank you to STFC.space for having such a nice place for us to pull these screenshots from and give them to you. So now let's take a look at a battle log example. And I've got a simulated log that we'll look at here in a second, kind of going from taking a look at and understanding how some of these can look and using the mitigation calculator to show that. But first, let me give you an actual look of a big fight, because then I think a lot of people really enjoy the really big fights. I mean, I know I do, where I want to see how the whales are getting on because I'm not there yet. So to give an example of that, we're going to slide right over to our buddy Alm. Thank you for this screenshot with a Pilum versus a Coronar. Now, we've talked about in our best warships of the 40s video that, hey, the Coronar has a natural advantage over the Pilum, and the Coronar gets undersold because it can create just as much, if not the same amount and more damage than a Pilum. Because the Pilum is front loaded with 7 shots in that first round, we always gravitate towards the Pilum. But the Coronar is actually a really, really good rare ship and will do everything the Pilum can do as well. Just doesn't have that same level of firing pattern that most people get really giddy about with the Pilum, and understandably so. But the point I'm making is the Coronar has a natural advantage because it is a ship that hunts interceptors. Every explorer has a very high accuracy rating, and why that's important is every interceptor has a high dodge rating. So if you don't remember how the battle triangle works, this game has a simple triangle that focuses on battleships over explorers, explorers over interceptors, interceptors over battleships. And the way that they do that is using the mitigation metric that makes these officers so important. So Kang, for example, is a Trinity officer, boosting your accuracy, your piercing, so that you can lower your opponent's mitigation. Whereas Gowron does the exact opposite, boosting a defensive stat. So boosting your mitigation to make it harder for them to attack you. Mitigation simply determines how much damage actually reaches your shields and your hull. It's the first level of your battle log, and that is probably the most important stat in the game to boost up and down. So you have two sets of officers doing two separate things. The Coronar naturally should create a lower mitigation for the Pilum, meaning the Pilum would take more damage than the Pilum can deliver to the Coronar. But we negate that with officers in this fight. The Coronar is running, in my opinion, a good set. They're running Gowron to help counteract anybody running Marcus, and then running a critical and hull breach build, which means that Coronar was pushing out more damage than the Pilum. Believe it or not, the Coronar was doing a heck of a lot better damage-wise because criticals were going to get magnified by hull breach. On the left side, the Pilum, though, at 75% health, was able to beat the Coronar. Now, some of you are going to say, well, the Coronar was a tier lower, and that kind of offsets a little bit. The biggest thing is really officers and research, and you can tell the research is very similar, if not a little bit better for the Coronar, because the battle strength are very, very close. Now, there is this little bit of difference there, but if we're talking blank sheet versus blank sheet, the Coronar has a better advantage over the Pilum. And the Pilum is going with two types of mitigation officers. One, a piercing one, and one, a defensive one. And then they're also running Honor Guard Wharf to get criticals. So they're trying to boost their damage with criticals, but also thinking defensively and offensively at the same time. So the ship on the left is doing three things. The ship on the right is doing two things. Map that out in your head. Ship on the right, two things. Boosting damage with criticals and hull breach, and then boosting their mitigation, but nothing offensive. The one on the left is doing three, boosting their mitigation, lowering their opponents, and boosting damage. Now, on the left side, Marcus kind of gets negated by Gowron, but there's still Martok. And what Martok is doing is boosting a defensive value up to a point that it can kind of overcome the natural ability of the Coronar to supersede it, to beat it. And that's Martok's ability right here, boosting the dodge. So even though the Coronar has a natural advantage over the Pilum because it has high accuracy, if you've got a high level officer like a Martok, you can then fix that problem. It's the same thing that the Coronar did. The Coronar brought Gowron to counteract the Marcus, but there's no Kang here to counteract the Martok. Counteract Martok. You're not. So what you would find here in this battle log is the Pilum had a higher mitigation value than the Coronar, which is not how this would typically play out. But because the player on the left side came with the set to both attack offensively with mitigation and defend with mitigation, they ended up winning a fight that maybe they would have lost if they would have been running just about anything else. It's an interesting example of how these fights can be swayed by using mitigation officers, whether it's the Trinity or the Anti-Trinity. Now, all this can sound extremely confusing, so don't worry. We're going to make it a little bit more confusing by adding in actual math. Now, I want to point out, if you like this, join my Discord. There's a channel in my Discord called Stats Calculation for all the nerds who really enjoy doing this. I know in my alliance, and I poked at Dodger Badness about making this video because they really like doing this and they like using the mitigation calculator. And there are people who know this mechanic better than I do. People like Order to Chaos and Hugo and all these players that we have who really love nerding out over spreadsheets and algorithms. Well, you can come do it too. So join the Discord if you haven't already. All right, enough plugging my Discord aside. Let's talk about this. So what I've done here is on the left side of your screen, I plugged in my maxed Vidar, a tier 9 Vidar, and on the right side, a tier 9 Kumari. And you can see the mitigation that we're talking about, 23.9. That means the Kumari is only going to deflect 24% of the damage the Vidar creates. So 76% of that damage will go directly to the shields, then the hull of the Kumari, basically putting a big old hurting on it. Now at the bottom of the screen, you'll see what happens if we were to add stats. And this is where the Anti-Trinity officers come in. So if I were to add 10,000 stats, you see right here at the bottom, see that plus 10,000 to shield deflection, this one right here? Scroll over. See how that would then raise the mitigation and then how it would lessen the amount of damage taken? And that is what you're hoping to do with an officer like Gowron or Martok, whether you're directly, going against an officer, like if you're trying to purposely stop a Marcus from taking you down, or if you're trying to boost something that maybe you can't overcome. So like 75,000 armor piercing in a Vidar is really tough to overcome for a player with a Kumari. Even with a maxed out, Bael to boost your armor, the ability of you as a player in the 20s to, fix that, I guess you would say, basically double your armor is really tough. You need a lot of stats to do that and a lot of stat stacking from your officers. It's really tough to do that in a Kumari with a common ship. However, if you notice, these shield piercing and accuracy numbers for the Vidar are really not that high because they're focusing on armor piercing because they're just a interceptor. So if you look right here on the screen, if we were to boost these, you can see we can lower the amount of damage we're taking by boosting the opposite, maybe that we wouldn't expect. So we're running right here, the Gowron, I'm increasing our shield deflection, even though that's not the primary stat of the ship that we're on. And that is a second potential use here. The tricky thing with the anti-Trinity officers like Gowron is knowing when can I actually use them. They're great for offsetting piercing values of other officers, but maybe could also be used to help offset some triangle battles by giving you more stats in an area that ship is not expecting. This is all going to vary based on what you're fighting. And the trickiest thing in this game right now is that we have so many officers, it's getting harder and harder and harder to load out in terms of a general fighting sense. Even this crew, I'm not here to tell you that this is an amazing crew. However, if we swap out this Kang for a Marcus and ran this against a Mayflower, surprisings could happen. Certainly could. In fact, Om's been sending me pictures, like a lot of pictures lately. Dude, you're sending me a ton of battle logs. But I'm not complaining. And the reason why is we can show you a ship like a Kumari taking down Centurions. Yeah, but maybe going even above that. Would you believe it would take down an Augur? It can happen using mitigation and piercing officers. Man, maybe I should show y'all that. Maybe I should. How about an ISS Jellyfish? We'll do that one. Even though it doesn't have the defensive officers, I think it's a very impressive fight. So we'll send you this real quick. I'm going to just lower it here so we can take out the names because we're not trying to shame anybody here. But here's a Kumari using Marcus, a piercing officer, to destroy an ISS Jellyfish. Granted, the ISS Jellyfish was a half health, but it's still hilarious to see an ISS Jellyfish get blown up by a Kumari. It was running Pike Morochin. I get that. No officers on the right side. But you can see how boosting piercing values, because the Kumari's shield piercing is not near high enough to beat a Jellyfish. You need Marcus here to make that happen. And then you've got a defensive mitigation officer in 5 who boost all of the defensive stats, making sure you take less damage. So what you'll find is whether it's the Trinity or the Anti-Trinity, there are uses if you know what you're fighting and how to load out your crew. And hopefully this video gave you the math of how things worked and gave you a better idea of when to use them. Truth is, though, it's going to depend on what you're fighting. And if you have needs of that, come to me, whether in the comment section below or directly on Facebook and Discord, and we will work through what you should be loading out on your ship and how these officers can affect you. Short story, though, most of these officers probably not that effective to about tier 3. I will say that right now, if you do have lower level players, if you're in the 20s and 30s, players running these tier 2 Marcuses, tier 2 Gowron would be better to counteract that and would give you higher mitigation. So it does have immediate use and probably earlier use than the piercing officers do, but keep that in mind when you're playing through it. Officers like, Lorca, Killy, Khan loadouts might still be better, and 5 of 10 as captain might still be better, but there are uses for these and they definitely have value in the game, and I'm glad that they're here. If you enjoyed the video, I ask that you do simple things like it. Looks like this. See the thumb? Yeah, right over there. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already to get notified of every time we go live and every time we're doing stuff on the channel. And last, but absolutely not least, thank you for being here. Live long and prosper. Stay safe with those Space Cowboys. We'll catch you on the next video about officers and maybe talking about that Jayla lady. Finally, coming soon. Yeah, coming soon. So thanks for being here again. And yeah, these videos won't stop getting long.
An even better outro than the intro. For the Empire and glory to your house.